what sloth was until I did this, but and one of the illustrations I did not put. Have you all seen that Geico commercial where the sloth is drawing? Anyway, I'd probably use that if I were doing it, just because I think that's hilarious. And but that's kind of how culture looks at sloth, is really slow, really lazy, and that's what we think of with sloth. But it really has a deeper meaning. And I'd never noticed this before, but in Matthew 25:14 through 30, which is the talent guy, the one talent man who buries his in the ground. Well, in the English Standard Version, it calls him wicked. He's a wicked and slothful servant. And I never noticed that wording before. And I don't know if all the other translations words it that way. I think it may be lazy in most of them. So, but I thought that was interesting. So it made me ask the question, why was he slothful? What made him this way? And so really, one of the early church fathers in point number 1 calls this anxiety of the heart. And it's related to sadness at our present circumstances. And so it causes us to lack motivation. That's really what slothfulness is. So it's not just about laziness, although it leads to that, but it's something a lot deeper than that. And number 2, slothfulness then leads to spiritual apathy, in which we give up on trying to connect with God because we believe there's no point in trying. Now, and this is where I think the deadly sin part comes in, right? Because when we get so disheartened that we begin to give up on God and who God created us to be, that's a really bad place to be. I mean, that's depression. And it's and it's really difficult. And so you could just see this downward spiral. So it's kind of funny to laugh at slothfulness and being lazy and say, you're lazy, you're a sloth. But when you really get down to it, this one talent guy, it makes me wonder if he was so apathetic that he gave up on God, right? And so he's scared of God, obviously, from that text. And so he buries it in the ground. But he also doesn't believe a lot about himself. He doesn't have a lot of confidence in himself and who God created him to be. And that's where we get with slothfulness. And then it made me realize in point, kind of what I would do in point number 3, is a lot of times we think something is a sin because, like lust is pretty easy to say it's a sin because it causes all these bad things. But really, things are a sin, not just because they're unpopular or because culture doesn't like them, but things are a sin. The reason why God thinks that sin is bad is because sin destroys us and it destroys other people. And the reason why the sin of slothfulness is so bad is because it destroys us, right? It destroys the image that we were created in. And it causes us to be less than what God has created us to be. And that's the real danger with slothfulness. And so that's how I would end and focus the sermon, is basically saying, look, no matter who we are, God has created us to be special. All of us. We may feel like failures all the time, but that's not what God created us to be. God created us for a purpose, and a good purpose. And so we have to reclaim that. And so that's sort of the way I would go with slothfulness. So I've put a few kind of illustrations in there for you. So really that Wall-E movie, I don't know if y'all have seen that. That was the illustration I kind of gave for slothfulness. But, being created, and you can find a lot of different things the way God has designed and created us around who we are. So, I thought I would, when I was looking at my own deadly sins, I thought, lust, all those big ones, pride. I found slothfulness at times in my life to really have been a big issue. So bigger than I ever anticipated. So anyway, some of you know that you start having a difficult time. It's easy to beat yourself up and go down and get worse and worse, and it's hard to get back up when you have fallen that far down. So, thoughts, comments? Trying to go a little faster because I see Chick-fil-A outside. Oh, really? Okay, so You could go get some. Okay.
Tell them what I told you last night. When I was coming through the 44-day ministry, John Ripley, I don't know if y'all know John Ripley or not, but he interviewed me. And he quoted some author who'd written this book about the Seven Deadly Sins. And this author had concluded that the two worst ones was avarice and sloth. Well, it clicked in my mind, avarice. Greed. Right there. All I could think about on sloth was tree sloth. I mean, it's like, that's what came to my mind. I couldn't get anything else there. And I was all around the bar. You talk about an interview.
Which, to that point, some of the really early church monks believed sloth was the worst of the deadly sins. And they really said it hit them right around lunchtime, maybe a little after, because they began to get hungry and weary in their praying. And so when they began to get weary and hungry in their praying, they would begin to give up and think, what's the point of doing all this? And so they felt like it was a huge barrier to their relationship with God. So... Yes.
So I wonder if you had the point that maybe it's just being real intentional about what it's going.
Very true. That's true.
Like that old, my brother used to have a bumper sticker that said, I may be slow, but I do poor work.
There you go. That would be a great opening right there. I may be slow, but I do poor work. I love I'd write that one down. I think that's pretty good. All right. Any more on slothfulness? All right. Well, the next one for 3:18, I was going to do anger. Here's the problem with anger, and the opening kind of points to that, is that anger is actually a real emotion that all of us have. And you can't just say, don't ever be angry, because it's a natural emotion to be angry. And if we're never angry, that's not a good thing. You know, there are ways that you have to express anger. Counselors tell us that all the time, right? I had a counselor tell me, you need to be angry about this. You know, I'm like, I thought anger was a sin, but not in this case. You know, there are good times to be angry. Matter of fact, Paul in Ephesians says, be angry, but do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not make room for the devil. So Paul even acknowledges, hey, there is room for anger, and we're going to get angry. Jesus got angry, right? And that's a passage you could use here. You know, and he went to the temple, and he got angry. And so we have to figure out, how do we talk about anger, but not make it so that all anger is wrong and bad? How do you differentiate between those two things? And so I used, again, Jesus is talking about anger in the Sermon on the Mount. Anger is not getting what we believe we deserve. This comes from Andy Stanley, by the way. We are owed something from somebody, and the problem is that we may never get what we deserve from the people we are angry with. Now think about that. When we're angry with somebody, most of the time it's because we believe that they owe us something that they have not given to us, whether it's love, whatever that might be. The reality is that person is never going to give us that thing. So we can stay angry for our whole lives over that. I mean, because the reality is there are some things that can't be repaid, right? When somebody owes us something, you know, say a sexual assault, and somebody has taken that away from somebody else, that person can never repay that, right? That debt that's been taken, that can't ever be repaid. That can't ever be repaid back. Never, ever can that person ever do enough stuff that's going to make that okay, right? And so there are just times when the debt that's owed us is too great, and it's never going to be able to be paid back. And we can stay angry about that for the rest of our lives. So that's a great point I think Andy Stanley makes. Number two is anger, no matter how insignificant it is, if left untreated, begins to impact our relationship with God and other people, right? If we let that go, and there's a quote from C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity about the speck can be just as bad as murder if left untreated. So, which ties into the whole Jesus thing, right? To be angry is to basically commit murder, anger in our hearts. Number 3, Jesus says that anger will consume us until it begins to form our identity. Have you ever seen the movie Grumpy Old Men? That's what I always think of when I think of grumpy old men. It's like it's formed them. And then Jesus' advice is to forgive. And that's the habit of the heart, right, is forgiveness. This debt's never going to be repaid, and so we've got to begin to be able to forgive because it's not just about what it does for this other person, but it releases us from that. So, yeah.
I don't know if any of y'all have heard of Gary Christian. Gary's daughter and her boyfriend were killed in Knoxville.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I sat and prayed for that man because I saw the anger in his heart.
Mm-hmm.
His eyes, his face, his whole body just, during the time of the trial,
Mm-hmm.
I sat there whenever they showed him on the news, and it's just a nervous twitch
Mm-hmm.
of anger. Recently, he has reconciled that anger.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's going around to different churches. I think Howard Hill has had him on his show or anything. But I think about how the hurt he was in and the anger he was
Mm-hmm.
feeling and how it drove him. And now that he has reconciled himself, that he was, I guess to what point he can, did he recognize the anger was
Mm-hmm.
hurting him, hurting his relationship with God.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
it's a very interesting story.
Yeah. That's a great story. And if I were preaching that sermon, that's a story I'd probably want to use towards the end. I put one in there of another one I found. I read a story a while back. I used it in a sermon several years ago. But stories like that where it's been in forgiveness that people are able to let go of that anger and become, again, the people who God created them to be. Because anger will kill us. I mean, it just will. And so, but yeah, that's how I would end a sermon like this with a story like that, because it challenges us, look at the people in our lives. It may not be as significant, but there are people that we are angry with, and we're holding on to that, and we need to let go of that. So, yeah.
Are they cousins?
Say that one more time.
Are bitterness and anger the same thing, or are they cousins?
I would say from the things, I think there was one book I read that bitterness was a cousin to anger. They were in the same family of vices. So anger was the bigger one, so it gets all the attention. So.
I think there's a contrast with God giving us happiness and anger taking that away.
Mm-hmm.
So again, back to the contentment.
Mm-hmm.
How do we learn, as Paul said, to be content in every
Right.
situation? Because the contentment brings us to the peace and happiness.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Anger destroys.
Right. Yeah. And I do think it's important, though, that we don't just tell people to gloss over the hurt that's been done. And I think you're making that point, too. It's, yeah. Sometimes I'm always too quick to say just forgive, but forgiveness can be a process, too. You don't always just, I don't know about you, I can't just sit down and be like, boom, you're forgiven. You know what I mean? It's something that we got to work through ourselves. It doesn't just happen overnight all the time. But yeah, it is coming back to contentment, and I agree. So.
Recognize your own fallibilities. And years ago, I got in an accident down Chattanooga. A fella flipped me, drove me backwards down 75. The boat came to rest at the guardrail, and we got out. And I started to talk to him. He was a younger guy. He says, "I can't believe you're not angry." I said, "If you'd known how many accidents I had caused when I was a young man, you'd understand why I'm not angry."
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's a great story. If you were preaching that a way to talk about anger, and make a point that, a lot of times we're able to let go of some of the anger because of our own past. So.
There's a number of people in our churches that have unresolved anger,
Mm-hmm.
that they have not given themselves permission to let out.
Yes.
And it's just simmering. And trying to do that in a church context of sermon of just recognizing that population
Mm-hmm.
and how do we help people.
Yeah, I think it's a great, and I've seen, in counseling they'd probably say journaling would be a great, to journal some of those emotions. I've seen people write things down and burn them, and
Right.
but yeah, that's a great, some ideas about how do you, and if, a lot of times the people you're forgiving, they may not be there for you to actually forgive face to face. You might have to find a symbolic way of letting some of that go, too.
And it's also, could also be a very good time to deal with people who are angry with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I spoke with a mother just recently whose daughter was a very gifted athlete, lost a leg, in fact, all the way up into her pelvis to cancer. And she's angry with God now because he took so much of her life away. And when she prayed for a miracle, she didn't get it.
Right.
So now she's angry with God.
Yes.
So I've got a 17-year-old girl that, I'm having to try to work with to try to bring her confidence back where she can understand that it's okay for her to resent the loss.
Right.
But she needs to understand somewhere in there find God's purpose
Sure.
for her life now.
Yeah.
Not what her purpose was before, but what her purpose is now. But dealing with that anger with God. A number of years ago, I read a book by Johnny Erickson Tata called When God Weeps. And in that book, she talked about one of the aspects of healing for her was to come to a point where she realized that it was okay for her to tell God she was mad at him.
Absolutely.
And then to deal with that anger.
Absolutely.
So, helping our congregations, because there are a lot of folks in our congregations that have that kind of
Yes,
anger as
absolutely.
well, for a loss or an injustice or whatever, and they feel like God is actually to blame for
Yeah,
that.
I think that's a great. And Will Willimon, in his chapter on anger, talks about one of the best ways to deal with anger is to let people be angry at God and let them know that God's big enough to take their anger and to still love them and still walk with them through that. And so that's a great point. Thank you for that. All right. Y'all ready to go to greed? I used this Chris Jansen song when I was at PAL. Have you all heard this song? I ain't rich, but I sure want to be. Working like a dog all day ain't working for me. Basically, he wants to buy a boat and a truck to pull it, and a Yeti 110 ice down with some silver bullets. But I love money can't buy everything. Well, maybe so, but it can buy me a boat. So, yeah, I love that song. Anyway, when I used that illustration, I didn't know what a Yeti was, and so they had to tell me from the congregation. I was like, "What's a Yeti anyway?" And anyway, so dealing with greed, I think greed is one of these funny things that nobody likes to admit they're greedy. I mean, you think about, we'll admit a lot of things, but nobody wants to actually admit we're greedy, and probably, let's just be honest, as middle class, upper middle class Americans, all of us are. I mean, just the way it is. So it's the thing that nobody wants to admit, but the thing that probably when we begin to examine, we'll all find that in some way or another we are greedy. And so Matthew 6 is the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus deals with greed. Jesus warns us that no matter how much we have, it will never satisfy us, right? It turns into rust in time. Our happiness with it deteriorates. In there, I didn't quote this, but I remember seeing like a couple who made $75,000, any more than a family bringing home $75,000 does not increase happiness. So money up until a certain point does kind of help with happiness. I mean, obviously, if you can pay the bills, that's a comforting thing. But once you reach a certain point, money brings no extra happiness to a person's life, which I found pretty interesting. So basically, it's when we have enough to meet our needs, there's not much else after that that's going to make us any happier.
A good scene for that, for the last scene of
The Jerk, okay.
when he has lost everything, it's taken just what he needs to survive in life.
There you go. Write that down. If you want to use a movie clip, that'd be great. Yeah.
This goes right back to the self-esteem stuff too, because I agree with you about the money point. I think what we start doing, I mean, not the church, I mean everywhere else, is valuing ourselves by comparing our salaries, contrary.
Yes.
If someone's making more than me, I don't maybe need to make that much money, but does that mean they're more important? And
Yeah.
and we and it becomes a self-esteem issue right off the bat. Maybe I'm plateaued, maybe I'm
Right.
whatever. So.
Yeah, when my brother started making more money than me, that was hard on me. Like, I really struggled with that. I was like, I have a master's degree. He barely, because I wrote his papers, has a bachelor's degree. And he is making more money than me. So, I mean, I struggled with that. So, yeah. And, you know, I know we don't struggle with this as pastors either, right? With one another when, you know, we don't get the appointment that, anyway, I shouldn't go down that rabbit hole because we're not talking about us. We're talking about other. All right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's good. Jesus also warns us that when we rely on money for our security and happiness, it becomes a god, right? I mean, that we replace God with money. Jesus' solution is keep in the forefront that God is the giver of all our resources and learn to be content. There's that word again, with what God gives. Learning to be generous is the number one way to do that. And so generosity then, right, would be the habit of the heart that goes a long way to dealing with greed. And, you know, I think helping young people especially learn that what you invest in can bring joy and happiness, and giving can do that too. Like, I think it's kind of cool to help young people when they're starting their life off together, like maybe even in premarital counseling, to look at all the fun things that you could give to, you know, that invest in. I don't know, you know, we can make it fun also. So anyway, that's my greed stuff. I also use the eating 7 golf balls in that as well. So one of the ones I gave you is Richard Stearns. Have y'all? He was the guy. He wrote the book "The Hole in the Gospel." Have y'all read that book, "The Hole in the Gospel"? He's not. What group is he with? Not Compassion is the other one, the other big one. World Vision. That's what it is. World Vision, and he was this huge CEO of a large corporation making millions of dollars, and just felt like God calling him to do something different. And so he stepped into it right when the economy was crashing. You know, he stepped into this nonprofit, and he wrote that book based on that. So, all right, Maundy, Thursday. I did envy on Maundy, Thursday because I like the idea. You know, the Luke 22 passage, these guys are sitting around having this last meal with Jesus. I think maybe some women were there too. They just didn't get mentioned. But they're all sitting around, you know, having this meal with Jesus. And they're arguing. Jesus is, you know, basically saying, I'm going to die, right? And they're all trying to figure out which one of them is going to be the greatest. I don't know if you've caught that in the... It's almost comical that what these disciples get into. And so I thought envy would be a great thing to talk about on Maundy, Thursday. And how these disciples, you know, you think about there's like, you know, 3 disciples that kind of were a step above the other disciples, you know, and part of me was wondering, are they going to be in charge? You know, what about me? You know, I could do this. And I could just imagine what was going on around that conversation. And so I thought envy would be a great way to talk about it. The opening, it was really cool about Olympic medalists. And the Olympics are coming up, so that would kind of be a good tie-in. But people who win bronze medals are typically happier than people who win silver medals. You may think, well, that sounds odd. People who win silver medals are normally thinking about what they did wrong to keep them from being in first place. Whereas people who win bronze medals are just happy to be up there. So there you go. So point number 1 is we often believe the desire to be great is a virtue, and it certainly can be useful. However, when we desire to be great at the expense of someone else, we've misstepped. And that's really where envy kind of comes in. And again, thinking about pastors, let's just be honest. Sometimes we want to see pastors fall deep down inside our hearts. maybe the pastor that got the big appointment that we didn't get, and we, secretly deep down inside, whether we want to or not, we're pulling against them, instead of pulling for them, kind of. Anyway, I just throw these things out there. So there's a difference between jealousy and envy. They're closely related, but jealousy is desiring what someone has. Envy is desiring to be someone else and doing it at their expense. Do you see the difference between that? Number 3, unfortunately, like the disciples, envy strikes at the heart of churches who want to be bigger than the one next to them. So there you go. You can pull something out for your churches. That we have church envy, don't we? Sometimes we want to be the church that we're not. Have you all done this before? You secretly, like when the Baptist church pastor messes up and there's like 400 people who leave the church, and you're sitting there thinking, what an opportunity to do evangelism. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. So, number 4, the best cure for envy may be Jesus' own advice to his disciples to love one another as I've loved you, which is the whole point of Maundy Thursday, right? The new mandate or command to love each other. So anyway, I feel like there's a great, in this book, I didn't use it in what I gave you, but Andy Stanley does this great thing in this book about he and Louis Giglio. I don't know if you know about Andy Stanley and Louis Giglio. They're best friends. And Louis Giglio started the Passion Movement, but would fill in for Andy Stanley at North Point, Andy Stanley's church, and did a singles ministry there. Well, at a certain point, Louis Giglio decided to start his own church called Passion Church, right? That's what it's called in Atlanta. And Andy Stanley said a lot of people would come up to him and say, I'm so sorry that Louis Giglio did this to you, and Andy Stanley, basically said I had to, in some ways, in my own mind, had to fight off envy because I knew Louis Giglio was a much better preacher than me. We're best friends. And so he said we both had to learn to celebrate for each other. And he said one of the things, Louis Giglio got back from a big Passion conference in Africa and came back. And the first thing he said to Andy Stanley was, you won't believe all those people in Africa and how much they love you and that they are, how much you've helped them. Instead of coming back saying, you know how many people we got saved down there? Do you see the difference? And so they supported each other. And I think that's the point to cure envy is instead of pulling for each other's demise, that we pull for each other to do well. And I think Methodism would benefit from that really greatly if we could learn to pull for each other. Even the Methodist pastors we don't particularly care for, because there are people that personalities, they rub us wrong. But we begin to pull for each other's success. I think it would help our connection tremendously. But anyway, I shouldn't be preaching. I should just go through my stuff for you. So, all right. Any thoughts on envy? We're almost done. I know y'all are getting hungry. All right. I'm going to try to finish in 9 minutes. Are you ready? 2 sermons to go. Good Friday and Easter. I did Pride for Good Friday. And the reason I did that, and it's kind of my last point, is that I feel like pride is what put Jesus on the cross. And it's Jesus' humility on the cross and his humility in life that allows us to be humble and to rely on God to cure our own pride. And so that's why I put that for Good Friday. I used the Philippians text about Jesus humbling himself. But I think easily you could use a Good Friday, Jesus on the cross, Father forgive them kind of a thing for pride. My points about pride is I believe that pride is the sin from which all other sins come from. It's the root. C.S. Lewis says it's the foundation. That's what Thomas Aquinas says. They both say that you can find every other vice, every other sin that we have has its origins in pride. C.S. Lewis says it's what's responsible for every war that's ever been fought, for every bad deed that's ever been done. Pride is at the root. And so pride is, number 2, the only sin that can take even good things and make them sinful. When we do I think we as Christians struggle with this all the time. You know, when we overcome like lust or anger and those things in our life, well, we take pride in that, right? And so then we look down. You know, John Wesley struggled, right, with coal miners all the time, that they would come and they would have this transformed lives. But what would they do after they had their transformed lives? They'd look down on all the other coal miners, you know, for their drinking problems. And how easy it is to take even good things and become prideful, and pride tear those things down. Pride is really the idea that we can become God ourselves and that we have the answers to all of our problems. And when we become like that, well, the gospel is really not much use for us anymore, is it? So, and that's why I think Jesus' death on the cross is related to pride, and that Jesus' act of humility on the cross gives us the power then to overcome the pride in our own lives. So, anyway, that's my Good Friday. Thoughts real quick?
At least turn some people off, and that's walk to Emmaus.
Mm-hmm.
Some friends didn't let their kids go through walk to Emmaus because the kids that had gone through walk to Emmaus segregated themselves from the people who didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Good thing.
Yes.
Good thing to share, but don't let something good happen and then, as you said, segregate and become prideful like the coal miners who found it.
Yeah. Yeah, pride is a difficult thing, and it's easy to creep in, for the last couple of years being in recovery ministry. Well, there's a sense of pride in recovering, right? Being a recovering alcoholic, but it's, if you're not careful, it's easy to look at people who are coming from where you have been and to feel so good about yourself that you look down on other. Again, it's an us versus them sometimes. I've even found it's funny listening to people who do recovery churches, the way they bash sometimes Sunday morning churches to say what we do here is better than what they do on Sunday morning, or this is real church versus non-real. It's just, pride is a tough thing. I mean, it's just hard, and constantly we just have to keep those things in check. I mean, I was driving down the road going to hear somebody preach a couple of weeks ago, and I got behind this truck, and it had those, the flags, the Confederate flags on their truck, and my first thought was, oh man, they're the worst rednecks in the world. I can't believe that. I mean, I was just giving them in my mind down the road, and then it was almost like God said, well, what about the prejudice in your own life? You ever thought about that? You're too busy judging them. You don't even know why they have that on their truck. So there you go. I was prideful that I was better than the rednecks in front of me. So yeah. Was it Nadia Boltz in one of her books? She was talking, her congregation is made up of a lot of gay folks, and one day they advertised, she was on TV, and so the next Sunday, in her mind, all these regular people came to her church, and she didn't know what to do with they ruined the church. And then she realized that she was just as prideful as, the people on the other side of the theological debate. So, I mean, again, even good things can go awry. So, all right. And finally, Easter, 4:1. I don't know about you, Easter is one of the toughest sermons, I think, to preach. I mean, after you preach so many Easter sermons, I mean, you kind of run out of stuff. So, it's like Christmas Eve. I mean, but I was going to do hopelessness, and I was thinking about that Beatles song, Imagine There's No Heaven, and the hopelessness that brings. And then use that 1 Corinthians passage. I think maybe 1 through 23 may be a bit too much scripture to read all at one time, so you might want to divide it up, or however you want to do it. But one of the points Paul makes is that Jesus' resurrection is a down payment to our resurrection. Resurrection gives us hope when we and those we love face death, and resurrection is the hope that death doesn't win. This matters because it says a lot about God and the hope that we live by. When I preached this sermon before, and it was just so happened it was the year, remember Kentucky, they went undefeated like all year long. Do y'all remember this a couple years ago? And they got in the NCAA tournament, and they lost in the tournament. And so I use the example like to say that Jesus did all of this stuff and got right up to the end, and that was it, and he was dead in the tomb and no more. Reminded me of what Kentucky basketball fans were dealing with. But it says that it would say that God couldn't finish the deal, you know. And so Jesus' resurrection gives us the hope that God finished the deal in Jesus. And it gives us the hope that God's going to finish the deal with us too. So anyway, that was just a thought.
Preaching on a passage like 1 Corinthians 15 on Sunday, do you think that people would miss having Mary?
You know, I worried about that. I did that. I did this passage. I've only done it one time, not preach on a gospel passage. And I did it because I had preached on them for, 15 years, like over and over again. I'm like, for my own personal health, I have to do something different. What I did, of course, I had a video capability, and so I showed a video of the resurrection from John's gospel, I think it was. And so I did that at the beginning of the service. And so we had that video come on, and we had drums kind of barely. And then as soon as the video ended and Jesus was out of the tomb, the band, and it just, the lights all flashed on, and it was this huge. But you obviously can't do that everywhere you go. So, but that's what I did. So, but you might have to read the Easter text. You might have to do that, which is okay. Sometimes it's funny in evangelical churches. We always talk about how important the Bible is, and then we read one little bitty piece of the Bible in our Sunday worship. Maybe it's a good thing to read multiple texts. So, gone are the days when you used to read all the lectionary texts. Y'all remember that? Some of y'all used to read them all. So, maybe it's okay to read several passages. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. I like that. I don't know if y'all heard that, but it's to use the Easter story as a prayer, as a way to engage in prayer. So, yeah. Well, good. Are y'all hungry? Do you want them to eat?
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Pray for us here so we don't choke.